Let me just do a brief little survey of the audience as we start so you two can get a sense of where things are. How many of you watched some of the Olympics? Okay, yes.
Fantastic.
How many of you are watching some WNBA because of the Caitlin Clark phenomenon? How many of you were watching it before the Caitlin Clark phenomenon? All right, so interesting. How many of you feels sadness and disappointment in the commercialization and professionalization of college athletics? Okay. How many of you have, be careful now because this is not meant to be a survey of your virtue. It's time for honesty. And how many of you have genuine concerns about the whole transgender issue in sport? And that could go in all sorts of directions, right? So you see a little sense of our audience, right? So let's get started. First slide, please, James. All right. So as you probably know, sports are a kind of metaphor. The military is a metaphor, and our cultural materials, our cultural debates, discourse finds expression through the military, through politics, through Hollywood, and so on. But sports are also a lens through which we look at such things. Just think of Colin Kaepernick kneeling at an NFL football game and the chaos that ensued from that moment. And so we'll come back to that. But sports are sports, and they're fascinating in and of themselves, but they also are kind of a barometric measure of the state of the civilization. And it turns out that most of the things we want to argue about, we can argue about through sport. Next slide, please. So here's a little cartoon. Wow, the US women are so much better than the men. Just wait till you all let us into the Oval Office. Well, we'll see, won't we, We'll see what happens in November, but this is now one of the most interesting political elections in my lifetime, and it's almost impossible to keep up with the radically changing circumstances, and there are still 70-some days until the election, so brace yourself. Much, much more is coming. Here are the topics we're going to try to get to tonight. I'm going to have to show some sports discipline, some moderator discipline, because every one of these subjects could take the evening. Caitlin Clark and women's sports. The role of money in sports, and particularly the multiplication factor that television brings to that. The professionalization of college athletics. The culture wars, shut up and dribble, and sort of as a subset of that, gender and transgender. Those are the 5 major topics we want to get to, plus a couple more, if possible. And if we don't get to them during the program, during the Q&A, feel free to bring them up. Doping, Vance Armstrong. Algorithms, which I'm fascinated by the algorithms, aren't you? When they poll somebody, the pitcher who's having a great game, and they poll him in the 3rd inning because they did an algorithm that said, it's really interesting to watch. Gambling, now legal. Sports washing, that's where, well, we'll explain it, but that's where the Live Golf series that Saudi Arabia is funding to the tune of billions of dollars to help wash its public image in the wake of its civil rights abuses, human rights abuses, and then fantasy sports. So all of that. So let's get started. I want to go to this. First, we've said goodbye this year to 2 giants in American sports, Willie Mays and Bill Walton. So now I was tempted just to show Bill Walton highlight films for the rest of the 2 hours. So, Paula, you have something to say about this fellow.
Well, I did, and it mirrors what you were saying about sports being a lens and intertwined with society, because I'll ask another survey question. How many of you are Grateful Dead fans? Okay. So my colleagues, Wright Thompson and Eric Neal, just put a piece out called Rhythm Masters, and I don't know if you know this, but Mickey Hart and Bill Walton were very good friends. And this is a documentary film about music intertwined with sports and how you can see the patterns of sport and music. And they interview several famous athletes all across different sports. It is unlike anything I think you've ever seen. It's not even if you're not a sports fan, if you're a music fan, you absolutely love it, and especially if you're a Mickey Hart, Grateful Dead fan. So it's on Hulu, and it's called again Rhythm Masters.
And it's called
Rhythm Masters.
And so, have you ever met him?
No.
No, and you neither.
No.
Actually, I talked to him on the phone once. So my dissertation was on student activism from the end of World War II to 1973 in Los Angeles. And Walton was insistent as an undergraduate that he was going to participate as an undergraduate in addition to being a basketball player.
It was very controversial.
Yeah, he was actually arrested in 1970 for protesting the war in Vietnam.
And he was smoking marijuana?
No, not publicly. Maybe yes, but not at the demonstration then.
Right.
But yeah, so I
And
got
you
to
talked to him, and
on
how
the
was
phone.
that?
Well, as you might imagine, Bill did most of the talking.
Did he invite you to come to his house and sleep in the sleeping
He
bag
did
on the
not,
floor
no.
like everyone else?
He did not.
And who's this poor fellow that had to work with him? He's the announcer who was the yes man to Walton?
Well, that's not his usual side guy. Paula, do you know, since I'm guessing that's an
No.
ESPN broadcast?
I'm blank. Help me
Anyway,
out.
you all know how crazy and wonderful and weird Bill Walton was. They will be missed, especially Willie Mays. But they both played really essential roles in the history of sports since World War II. So let's move on. All right, here's a little cartoon to get us started. Hi, Mr. Brady. Could you sign my football? I took the air out of it the way you like it. Scandals in sports, that was Inflategate, I believe that was called. Yes,
Inflategate.
Inflategate. Was that true? Did they actually do that?
I mean, I think it depends on who you ask. But
I'll bet it does.
yeah.
But it's never been ascertained absolutely whether that was a deliberate attempt to.
Well, or what effect it would have had or would not have had.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. But there are plenty of scandals. We could spend a lot of time on that. Let's move.
Spygate.
Spygate.
For, you know,
That was the
Also
Astros.
involving-
Or
No,
no?
Spygate was also the Patriots.
there were lots of gates.
Okay. Spygate was New England, but the Astros had the stealing of the signs in the
Yes.
2017
World
Series.
Series.
So anyway, but you saw how many people have watched some of the Olympics. I want each of you to reflect a little bit on that. Let me start just by saying I've been disappointed with the Olympics for a long time, for a number of reasons. And then the pandemic really sort of took some of the, not to get back to Inflategate, but took some of the air out of our interest in the Olympics. This seems to have been a spectacular, extremely well-received Olympics in Paris. Paul, what are your reflections?
So I sort of took the temperature of the Olympics from the one person I know who is more obsessed with the Olympics than anyone I know, who during the entire weeks of competition I would call and would give me the recap of, I didn't even have to look at ESPN, give me the recap every day. That was my 87-year-old mother. And
This is your mother?
This is my mother, yes. I mean, she can tell you everything about everything from like the women's mountain biking and their success to Simone Biles and everything. So I asked her, I said, what was like for you, what was really sort of the most sort of significant change in the Olympics? And she did not hesitate. She said, Snoop Dogg.
Snoop Dogg?
Snoop Dogg.
What was his role?
Well, that he had been he had done some with Tokyo, but the fact that he was, Snoop Dogg the rapper, right? The fact that he was at so many of these events and being part of NBC's coverage and just really lending this very entertainment focused and jovial and just sort of the spectacle of the Olympics and what she was saying by that, which you can see in so many other aspects of the Paris Olympics, is that this was a redemption sort of the fanfare and the joy and the comeback of the Olympics and just in the presentation of it, and then even in the storylines like Simone Biles now coming back after what happened to her in Tokyo, and so it just seemed like this was after a number of years, and the pandemic year was terrible, but after a number of years where it seems sort of bland, the presentation of it, and then also just the competition, and then some of the goofy things like breakdancing and all of it just made it far more engaging than it has been in years.
Here's the breakdancing. It came and went. It won't be back. It was a demonstration year. Fascinating what is in and what is not in for sport. But Paul, did you say your mother is 87?
She's 87.
And the words Snoop Dogg came out of her mouth.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And where does she live?
She lives in Omaha. Yep.
And this was for her, this was one of the phenomenon of the thing this year.
Oh yeah, and then she went on to explain that what I was saying is just how it was more engaging, it was more entertainment, and more just from her perspective, it just seemed that there was just a higher level of competition and a higher level of, and you know, she went off about some of the somewhat controversial things, but you know, according to her, because she's always an Olympics fan, like she would rate this like near the top.
And do you have a favorite Olympic sport?
I will tell you my favorite Olympic moment was Cole Hawker in the 1500 when I'm a runner, and his cross, like he was behind up until like just the very, and just, it was like the metaphor, I even tweeted this out, it's like a metaphor for life, like don't give up until, you're gonna put your all into that final stretch, and just seeing how he crossed the line in that race was like phenomenal. It was one of those, I didn't get to watch as much of the Olympics as I wanted, but being able to see that, and I was like, wow, that was like a jaw-dropping moment.
And so even though you're an investigative journalist and you've been around sport, including broadcast sport, for a long time, it still works for you. It still some of it still thrills you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I joke with people when they ask me what I do at ESPN. I say, oh, well, I ruin sports. It's my job. But I follow that up with, if you love sports, you should love them done right. And so much of that does come back to the beauty and the power that sports can have, and just those moments that, reaffirm the payoff of hard work and dedication and teamwork and, standing up for people, and just the inclusion aspect of sports. Like, all of those things still are positive, and I think part of what we do in calling out the negative is to hold people accountable so that that stuff stops.
Yeah. So Kurt, I was impressed by the Paris Olympics. I think one kind of iffy decision was to use the Seine for swimming.
Well, just for the triathlon section, and
right.
then I think they did one other, but they had a backup venue for the distance swim.
Right.
It was the triathlon that got them into the most amount of controversy.
Right. Not the best decision.
Well,
as bad as Rio?
Or
what are your
World Cup in
reflections
Qatar.
on this year's Olympics?
So I think this year's Olympics were successful for lots of reasons, and we focus a lot on the fact that the Seine didn't turn out the way the organizers had hoped. But Paris, I've never been to Paris, but it makes for a spectacular backdrop. The events that literally ran down the Champs-Élysées with the Arc de Triomphe in the back, that makes for spectacular television. But those are also images that are very recognizable to most of us in a Western television audience. One of the problems that the Olympics had for the last 3 cycles, 2 winters and 1 summer, was that they were all in Asia. And the reason I say that is the biggest thing is the time zone difference. I made the joke on our prep call. Supposedly Mark MacArthur made the joke about, made the line, don't ever get involved in a land war in Asia. I would imagine a TV executive is like, don't ever get involved in the Olympics in the Asian time zone. It just destroyed ratings and it wasn't even related to the pandemic. But also culturally, there is not nearly as much visual recognition for Western television audiences, whereas, everybody recognizes the Eiffel Tower. So there was a lot more, I think, cultural comfort with these Olympics. Another thing about these Olympics that we're sort of trying to figure out right now with college sports also is we're sort of okay with paying the athletes. We don't have to have the narrative that we used to have, where these people, sort of suffered namelessly for 3.5 years in sports that we never paid attention to until the cycle came around, and then we would watch them vigorously, and if they were lucky, they ended up on a Wheaties box. And these sorts of things now, we apparently love the basketball phenomena with the professionals in the basketball. basketball. But
Here's the so-called
yeah.
dream team, right?
But I mean, the tracksters now make. I mean, they still don't make what they're probably bringing in, but those we don't seem to have. Your memory of the 1500 wasn't diminished because coal had gotten a stipend.
Right.
So I do think that that's something that for a while the Olympics were anxious about. How will the encroachment of professionalization affect the audience's appreciation for the athletic demonstration? And I think we're discovering we're not troubled by it at all. And the other thing is...
I'm troubled by it.
And
aren't you troubled by this? I'm troubled by the professionalization.
But you all watched, though. Almost everybody raised their hands. You may have been troubled by it, but it didn't diminish your willingness to tune in.
Let's look at a pre-professionalization. Let's look at 15 for a moment. You'll all recognize this, I think. This was the Miracle on Ice from 1980 in upstate New York. Let's play this clip.
Hand is there. The puck is still loose. 11 seconds. You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. Morrow up to Schultz. 5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Remember? You've got to say that if that had been the NHL, we wouldn't have the same feeling about this.
I would agree, and in particular because the Soviet team that year probably would have taken the NHL out behind the woodshed. You have to, if you know much about international hockey, the Soviets rejected international sports early in its history because they saw international competition as overly bourgeois. And then they realized they were missing something in terms of the ability to create sort of an entry point for communist ideology. So they began participating in international sports in the 1950s. From 1954 until 1992, the Soviet Union, or the unified team as they were in 92, won every single world championship and every single gold medal except for 60 and 80, and both times they were upset by the United States. The people on that team, the goaltender, Vladislav Tretiak, is probably arguably, maybe not arguably, the greatest goaltender ever. He actually now runs a goaltending school in Minnesota for youth. Three guys, the so-called KLM line, Krutov, Larionov, and Martov, they all were invited to play in the NHL. Two of them were not old enough by the time the Soviets started letting them. Those guys had finally passed. But that was how good, that was an all-star team. There was absolutely no reason that anybody on the American team should have played with them. All of those were recent college graduates. There was nobody on that team over the age of 22. It is, in my mind, the single greatest upset in all of sports, and I'm not sure there is a second one that's close in my mind.
And isn't there a certain nobility to that this group of amateurs took on this state-sponsored, highly professionalized group and beat them?
Yes, but only because they won.
If they'd lost.
I mean, so I am with you. So I was 10 when this happened.
And you were thrilled.
And I grew up on the West Coast where it was on tape delay. And my brother came home and he'd already known what was happening, and he refused to tell me. So we watched it anyway. And when we were doing prep, you played the clip and I got goosebumps all over again. As a child, in sports, this is one of those memories that I'll never, ever forget. So I'm with you. But at the same time, as I said, it only achieved that status because they won. So 9 times out of 10, the Soviets are gonna win, and it's not gonna be close. And it was. They played 2 weeks before in an Olympic prep tournament, and the Soviets beat them, I think, 9-1. So they struck gold, literally, no pun intended. Although that isn't the gold medal match. We often forget that.
Right.
The tournament back then was a round robin. Even after that, we still could have lost based on goal differential, and then we had to go back and beat Finland 2 nights later. But in our mind, that has always become the gold medal match.
So Paula, do you have any thoughts about this? That my belief that something essential has been lost with the professionalization of the Olympics. Do you feel that or no?
I don't feel like it's been I think there's an interesting, uniqueness to and correct me if I'm wrong, but the U.S. is still the only country that does not have a governing, like a part of its government that is over sport, right? And that's always been the case with the Olympics. And so I think that adds something to it, like that obviously is a factor. But part of me actually, I find it interesting when the professional athletes can compete in the Olympics, and especially when you've got, when in the team sports, when they're competing against each other in their professional realms, but at the Olympics, they're all Team USA.
Right.
And that, I think, is why it doesn't, money aside, like that is why it doesn't seem to bother
It's not
me.
like the Lakers. It's like a group of different
Right.
players. Could you go to
Right.
17, just James?
Yeah.
So there's the dream team, and these are from different teams, of course. And you're thinking there's something that fixes it a little because it's not like just the Celtics.
Right. They're coming from, they're coming from all different. It's almost sort of the Olympics writ large is supposed to be a unifying, global. Everybody's getting along, even though we know that's not really the case. But I do think in some sort of microcosm way with the U.S. and with these professional teams, I think people like to see, somewhat like the All-Star Games, people like to see these athletes come together. And unlike the All-Star Games, like in this case, they're all Team USA.
Fair enough. All right. So let's go to 14 for a moment. So, Kurt, I want you to start here. This is Jesse Owens. This is the 1936 Olympics in Germany. Adolf Hitler's in the stadium. He's watching a black American athlete win this race. It's an extraordinary moment in world geopolitics. And you said there's more to this story, so tell us.
Well, there's several things here. Hitler referred to Jesse Owens and the black athletes on the American team as auxiliary citizens.
Auxiliary citizens.
And in that regard, he was sort of poking us where we were most vulnerable because, of course, he was referring to the Jim Crow status that was prevalent everywhere. Jesse Owens is actually from Ohio, but faced substantial discrimination at Ohio State.
Here. In the U.S.
Yeah, in the U.S. And that's, of course, not in a former state of the Confederacy. But this was a moment at which the American view on race is beginning to shift for the first time. What was not part of the Olympics, but the heavyweight title fight between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. They fought twice, actually. And the first time Schmeling beat Louis, and there wasn't a lot of unhappiness in the United States. Some of it was overtly racist. Some of it was also not a great troubling about sporting victory from the Nazis before we really understood exactly what the Nazis represented. But you get Jesse Owens, and then also the second fight between Schmeling and Louis, which is held in Yankee Stadium. Yeah, Yankee Stadium. And the American response to Joe Louis is markedly different. And not that this fixes anything by any means, but, and we're going to get a slide here in a minute, it's a drastically different American response to Joe Louis than what Jack Johnson had gotten just 20 years earlier.
So let's stay with Jesse for a moment, back 14. So, but when nations host the Olympics, especially nations that are regarded as the bad boys of the world stage, they want to showcase their progress, their human rights records, the splendor of their stadiums and so on. And you were saying that the torch, which we now assume is a central part of any beginning of the Olympics, is actually a German innovation.
The torch relay as we know it now is not something that dates to the ancient Olympics, nor did it even emerge with the reemergence in 1896. It was created in 1936 by the Nazi regime as a way to draw media attention. Purposely, it went throughout Germany with the intention of drawing media attention to how far Germany had come in recovery from the Depression, and thus, by definition, this is what a fascist state had to offer the world. If only your country was won by us, then this would be what things would look like. So this is Hitler's attempt at demonstrating at sort of putting a kinder, gentler face on fascism. And also by this point, because the Nuremberg laws have been passed already, there was tremendous pressure from within the United States that we shouldn't even go to the Olympics in response to the Nuremberg laws. And so this is also an effort to put a kinder, gentler face on National Socialism. And so the torch relay is something then that was what we now call sport washing.
We'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
But of course, the most famous torch moment in my lifetime was Muhammad Ali with his trembling late life holding, was that Salt Lake?
It was Atlanta.
Atlanta. That was an extraordinarily moving moment. Do you have thoughts about this, Paul?
I'm going to defer to the history professor.
All right, then. There we go. All right, so
we have a lot of ground to cover.
Let's go to 22. So this is Jim Jeffries versus Johnson, right?
Yes.
And so this was a fight in 1910 in Reno, Nevada, I believe. And Johnson was an African American. And the question was, can we find a white man who can beat him in a major boxing match? And there was a search for this, because the idea was that we had to vindicate not only the white race in terms of its athleticism, but that this somehow would then vindicate American attitudes towards race too. And Jeffries couldn't do it, could he?
No. There are so many things about American racism that are so paradoxically bizarre that defy any explanation. But we had no problems with blacks in boxing at lower divisions. It was the heavyweight division that was the problem. And it dated all the way back to John L. Sullivan in the 1880s, who refused to fight blacks. And as a result, the precedent was that the heavyweight championship should, and in essence, by most Americans, must be reserved for whites. And it has to do with some of the most primal, elemental things that boxing represents. The writer Frank DeFord once famously said, "We're never going to get rid of boxing or beauty contests because they reveal the most primal elements of the two genders." Now, what that says about Frank DeFord's views on women is another matter. But, I mean, so to have a black man as champion of the heavyweight division was something that was utterly untenable to most
Unacceptable.
Americans.
Theodore Roosevelt found it appalling to think that an African American could be the heavyweight champion of the world. This is not okay. And this is Roosevelt, who has a relatively progressive record on race.
Yeah. So once Johnson was able to win the heavyweight title, mostly by badgering and embarrassing the current title, and I can't remember who the title holder was that he took it from. But he just heckled the guy. I mean, he would go to ringside, and after he would win a fight, he'd say, "Well, you haven't really beaten anybody because you still won't fight me." I mean, in many regards, this sort of braggadocio would be very familiar in our modern media environment, where so much of what we do is about getting Twitter hits and you're following on social media. He engaged in that kind of behavior, but that was considered so much more unseemly 120 years ago.
And in the face of that no one could beat him, there was an actual national search for what was called the Great White Hope. So let's go to the next slide. And you've heard that phrase recently with respect to Caitlin Clark. And I find this phenomenon, Paula, extremely interesting, that Caitlin Clark is clearly a very, very gifted young woman and is now setting records in the WNBA and is one of the highest paid women athletes.
Well, she set records in the NCAA for both men and women.
Right.
So,
amazing.
Yeah.
And she is often pitted against Angel Reese. I think we have a slide of the two of them. And so this is sports commentators who are serious are really concerned about this, the pitting of this white woman against the African American and the way that this is used to generate ratings, and that it kind of stirs up some of these old race views and so on. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, from what I've seen with both of them, I mean, obviously they're both incredibly talented. I mean, I do think in many ways Caitlin Clark, just performance-wise, exceeds Angel Reese.
Exceeds, in your view.
Right. And her, I think for both of them, they are sort of capitalizing on what I think is this sort of perfect moment in women's sports, and also we're going to talk about this later with the whole NIL and college athletes making money and so forth, but they are both beneficiaries of Title IX, and they are both beneficiaries of a system of women's college basketball that has just gotten progressively better and better and better, and the product has gotten better. And if you look at, even in the last couple of years, the demands from women's basketball players, there was the great photo about during March Madness a couple of years ago of the weight room for the men, and it was this palatial, just amazing, and then the weight room, it wasn't really the weight room but it was this sad little picture of this weight bench,
a
with
barbell.
right, exactly, and really drawing attention to the inequities. And there was neither one of their coaches, but a women's basketball coach I talked to for a story this last fall, and we were talking about, in some sense, the difference in attention paid to the various women's basketball players. But I was arguing why do you think there isn't more attention, or why do you think the schools haven't promoted one more than the other? And one of the things she said, which was sort of a bigger picture, she's like, why promote this when the product isn't good? Because if you tell people, hey, you need to watch women's basketball just because it's the right thing to do, and then they watch it and they're like, oh, that's pretty lame. Why would I, why? You're not going to get them back. And her thing was, as the product got better and the rivalries got, more heated, then people will be more engaged with it. And then at that point then is when you start advocating and arguing for more promotion and more cut of the pie with the NCAA and more TV time. And so I think there's always sort of been this expectation with female athletes of gratitude, right? And this would go for regardless of the race, that, I'm just so grateful to be here, right? The thing that I like about both of them, Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark, is that they both have swagger. And I think people read into that something that's not, I think people read into that maybe a
racial element.
A racial element that is, everybody has a different opinion on this, I get that. But I think what's new about it is that this is something the men have had forever. It's always been okay for the men to trash talk each other, right? And for fans to get involved in that too. And here you've got these two female athletes, and this is one of the things I love about the stories about Caitlin Clark, especially they have swagger and they're unapologetic about it. And I don't think people are necessarily used to that from female athletes. And so I think when that happens, there's a reaction of no, this is how their male counterparts are, and let's take the gloves off with the female athletes because this is part of equity.
And so we're going to run out of time, but we have you here, and I'm so glad we have you here, Paula. So just give us a little background on the coming of Title IX and its revolutionary effect on sport.
Well, okay, so Title IX is about 51 years old, and its premise was, when it was passed initially as part of federal law, was to give equal opportunity to women in education and athletics. And that I'm going to cover a lot of ground with this, but basically what that meant was that schools, K through 12, and colleges and universities had to offer equal opportunity to male and female athletes. And it addressed many other issues involving sexual assault and sexual violence that are related, but not in terms of the equity of opportunity part. But over the years, colleges have sort of, and the public opinion has sort of struggled with, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that we have to start cutting men's sports so that we can have equal opportunity for women? And does it mean we have to spend the exact same amount of money on women as we do on men? Not necessarily, but it does mean that from that point forward, and it was a very slow progression, that schools had to provide equal facilities, equal publicity, promotion, all of that for their female athletes. And finally, as as we've seen recently, finally it's really starting to pay off. I mean, we talk a lot about basketball. As you pointed out, I'm from Nebraska, and this last year, our Nebraska volleyball team set a world record for the number of people to attend a women's sporting event. And for those of you who are football fans, I would say legitimately now, Nebraska volleyball is kind of a bigger thing than football.
No, you take that back.
And here's how you know it. Going back to the whole TV thing, you can go into a bar in rural Nebraska and see middle-aged white men trash talking on the TV, and it's not about football, it's about women's volleyball. And so it's all an advent of comes back to Title IX.
So Title IX is more than 50 years old, but as you've said, to pass the law is one thing. For it to actually catch up has taken a long time, and now it's beginning to really show, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, and some of that does parallel with the commercialization and the money.
So just one last question, and then Kurt. But when the history of the WNBA is written, Caitlin Clark is going to be a big figure in that history, because if you look at the statistics of attendance and pay and transportation and facilities and so on, she's not alone, but she has had an amazing galvanizing effect.
Absolutely. I mean, there was just a story out the other day about her own team and the attendance and the money that has come into it. I mean, yeah, it is a sea change, and so much of that is what we've already talked about, but so much of it is the TV opportunity and the fact that you've got all of these other. I would have to say that it's the sports industry writ large not looking at the WNBA as a charity case anymore, and looking at it as an actual revenue generator.
And weren't the attendance figures for the women's basketball finals, weren't they higher than for the men's this last year? I mean,
and the ticket prices too.
Right, amazing. Yeah. So, Kurt, what's your thought on all this?
So
cognizant again at the time.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I find intriguing about Clark, I find a lot of comparisons with her and Larry Bird in the late 70s and early 80s. And in particular, the points of comparison that I'm thinking about is cultural anxiety. The WNBA is mostly known to non-basketball fans or to people who want to criticize it as substandard basketball, allegedly. And what that really means is they don't play like men. So, and this is a problem that women's sport has had for generations, is if that's the measuring stick, we've set ourselves up essentially to fail. And for years they focused on no dunking, which is, I don't understand why that's got to be the
sine qua non. But that's the litmus test.
Right, yeah. That's the litmus test.
Not as much now.
Right. So it's allegedly inferior because it's not male. This is a league that is overwhelmingly dominated by black women, many of whom are gay. And they're outspoken about it. And the most famous example, the Atlanta Dream, was so outspoken in their social activism, they basically pissed off the owner, who was a Republican candidate for Senate, and she finally sold the team in sort of a giant conniption fit, basically. She was so unhappy with having all of these socially activist black women as her employers that she couldn't control, and was apparently unaware that this was Georgia, not in the 1850s, and so she sold the team. So this is and I think if you look at our contemporary politics, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty about opportunity. As a historian, one of the things I focus on is when we choose, and we don't always do this in history, but when we choose to commodify freedom. And what I mean by that is it's something that there isn't enough for everybody. And so I've got to make sure I get mine because there's not enough, and I'm damn sure going to make sure that that one doesn't get it because they're not owed, whatever that means. And I think if you look at our political discourse right now, there's an awful lot of commodification. And so while we're anxious about, and we're going to talk about gender and transgender, and we're still not entirely comfortable, I think, in certain circles with gay marriage, or it's okay, but hey, don't put it in my face, which is anomalous to going back to the 60s when we were talking about race in sports, but don't act too black, whatever that meant, okay? And so there's a certain amount of in-your-face element that I think many people find uncomfortable about the WNBA. And this was the same thing about Larry Bird and the NBA in the 1970s. We forget now the 1979 NBA Finals was not televised live. It was on tape delay. That was how marginalized the NBA was. They had no network television contract, and the NBA Finals weren't even televised live. But this is at a time after, and particularly in Boston, the busing riots. If you're at a certain age, you remember Boston's response to busing and the decline of, the what we now call the Rust Belt, and white working class, what we used to call ethnics, which were essentially Eastern European migrants who had settled in Michigan and then those Rust Belt towns. They historically voted Democrat, and they were becoming disenchanted with the Democratic Party and were soon to become Reagan Democrats. There is this anxiety in the 70s that traditional whiteness was being squeezed out, and they didn't like the NBA because they weren't. It wasn't a league that was dominated by white players. And then Larry Bird comes along, and whites from well outside of Boston started following the NBA again. And if you look at the rivalry between the Celtics and the Lakers in the 80s, underneath all of that, now the Lakers own the notion of Showtime, but what Showtime really meant was street ball, black basketball, these coded phrases that we use for sports that is allegedly undisciplined or in some way not how whites would play it.
So we're going to have to move on, but I want to ask one last question. It's a hard one, but I think it's worth asking. If Caitlin Clark were black or brown, what would the difference be? She's phenomenally talented, no question. Maybe one of the most talented college basketball players, women and men, of our time. But if she were not white, what would be different, Paula?
You know what?
Easy question.
Yeah.
It's a factor. It has to be a factor.
That's a hard one to speculate on, considering all of the other change that is happening at the same time.
Sure, do you think?
I'm deeply pessimistic. So I think there would be some. I mean, she's a spectacular athlete, and she does things that are literally, what I used to say is, I dare you to look away. I mean, her ability to shoot from anywhere is just absolutely tremendous. But I'm like I said, I'm deeply skeptical that corporate, mainstream, broadcast, marketable America is willing to really go all in on an athlete that isn't white.
And I think there is some great white hope feeling in all of this story. But let's move on. Money, 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 money. Next slide. Let's play this clip from
Jerry Maguire.
Jerry Maguire.
What can I do for you, Rod? You just tell me, what can I do for you?
It's a very personal, very important thing. It's a family motto. Are you ready, Jerry?
I'm ready.
I want to make sure you're ready, brother. Here it is. Show me the money.
Just look at it, but I think I'm taking too long.
The spot for a Glock. I took a loss over floss, but still got it knocked.
Money!
You remember, right? So, a couple of cartoons here. Amateur sports is dead, and then that does it. You're suspended. And it was thought for a very, very long time that there was something fundamentally wrong with universities and colleges making enormous amounts of money from their sports teams and having the NCAA rules in which athletes couldn't be paid, and scandal after scandal of finding ways to compensate them around the corners of the rules and so on. And recently this has all changed. So for those who don't know, Paula, what do NIL stand for?
NIL stands for name, image, likeness. And
name, image, likeness.
Yes,
meaning what?
Name, image, likeness. Meaning that for years, athletes were not able to profit off of their personal brand while they were a college athlete. And that all changed as two things. As a result of a Supreme Court ruling and as a result of some state law changes pertaining to athletics and without getting in the weeds on that. So now athletes can make money off of their name, image, likeness. They can do endorsements. They can appear in commercials. They can go on their social media and promote products. They can do, camps and get paid for it. I mean, they have help from the universities to do this. They can have help from advisors doing this. And there's really no limit as to how much they can make. And, it's not equal because the, quarterback of the football team is going to make a lot more money than a female tennis player, but they all have now the ability to do this, whereas before, if they took money for an autograph, they could lose their entire eligibility. It's night and day.
And car dealers are constantly trying to give cars to athletes, and
which they were before. Now they can just do it legally.
Yeah, some of that stuff was, but just today, there was a story, an announcement that Oklahoma State, on their football players' helmets, they're going to have QR codes. That if you're at home watching the game, you can, scan the QR code and make a donation to the school's name, image, likeness fund. That is how far it has come in just a few years.
And you're okay with this?
That's a hard thing to answer, because if someone's not okay with this, then the question is, well, are you okay with all the millions of dollars going to the coaches and going to the schools and the athletes getting, their payment as a good education?
Tuition and food.
And tuition and food and some palatial digs in their locker room, but they don't really get a cut of that. So it is now the Wild West in terms of how NIL is. I think there will be, there's an antitrust lawsuit that they're trying to come to a settlement. There will be some, right now we're sort of in the breaking the eggs to make the omelet thing, right? But this will eventually settle out. But there are, just in terms of the money aspects of it, when it comes to the individual players, you've got questions of, equity, because this all goes back to Title IX, because can you have male athletes making more money than female athletes? The Department of Education says no, but hasn't really offered any guidance on that. And then just, can schools that have wealthy donors buy all the good athletes? And that's what you're seeing happen.
So on the one hand, the argument was, well, college sports are really the junior leagues of pre-professionalism, and these are people that are making millions of dollars for the universities, and therefore it's only right under equity that they should be paid for all of that and not exploited in that way. The other argument on the other end of the spectrum was the NCAA held on for a very long time that no, we need to make this about education and collegiality, and that we don't want to go down that path. We're not even sure we want students to be able to leave college without getting a degree to go into major sports. And so there was I know where you're heading with this, because we always have this argument, but you're going to say that's been professionalized forever, and so get over it. Aren't you?
More or less. I mean, so the first intercollegiate athletic contest was a crew race between Harvard and Yale on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. Now, quickly, you're doing some mental math and you're deciding Harvard's in Massachusetts and Yale's in Connecticut. What the hell are they doing in New Hampshire? That's because a real estate developer paid them to pull out on Lake Winnipesaukee to advertise the lots that were for sale. That's the very first intercollegiate event in the United States, which was funded by outside money. In 1904, Harvard was tired about getting their butts kicked for Yale, so they finally broke down and decided to pay a full-time coach. It was the first time ever Harvard had hired a professional coach. They hired a guy named Bill Reed. As a player, he was the last guy to be on a team that beat Yale. He was there for 2 years. He only lost 3 games. 2 of them were to Yale. He got basically fired. But in between there, he'd ruined his marriage. He'd gotten addicted to drugs. But he was paid more than the university president.
Which is now routine, by the way.
Yes. So, we were having this conversation last night. What's the other alternative? And the other alternative is, of course, to do something that nobody's willing to do, which is to leave money on the table. The problem in college athletics is, from its very origins, we decided, for reasons that colleagues of mine have spent years trying to figure out that winning was the thing that mattered. And now that may seem sort of stupid, but we talk about, and this is Clay's point, college athletics should be about getting a degree,
Character
opportunity,
building.
character building, and I
Teamwork.
personally agree with all of that, except for the fact that that is never what college athletics has actually been about.
Wait a minute, it's never?
No.
Never.
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 And I would take the most obscure sport that you can find. If you were to ask a well-heeled alum of that team and say, hey, for an extra 50 grand, I'm going to guarantee that MIT is going to beat Caltech, and they had the opportunity to do it, they would do it because winning has always mattered. And that has always been the driving force. Now, you can come up with examples that didn't happen. For example, in 1939, Columbia actually gave up a victory because the official had made a mistake. And that may resonate with some of you here in Colorado because that got used in 1991 when Colorado had their so-called fifth down game. That won the national, that was the year they won the national championship. So everybody was pointing back to those moral paragons in 1939. So those examples do exist.
But you say this with such contempt, and you do. What kind of naivete are you engaged in here? The idea was, as I understand it, that you have a university or a college where people come to study astronomy and biology and mathematics and literature and philosophy. And then there are recreational activities for them that also create physicality and hygiene and health and team building and character building, and that this is part of a package to create a well-rounded human being. And the sports are not central to this, the sports are part of this, and that this is an ideal, and it's been completely perverted by guys like you who just want to say it's all about winning and it's all about money.
Your impression of the origins of college sports is
wrong.
inaccurate. I hate to bring that. College sports originated entirely as an undergraduate experience. They did it, in fact, often in the early years of college sports, faculty attempted to suppress college athletics. This was something that was like a student club that they came up with.
Right.
And then they invented, or basically sort of developed football, and it was sort of like fissioning the atom, and they didn't realize what they'd done. And because it became so big that the universities had to take it over. Because you couldn't, so for example, think about just from a venue management perspective. No undergraduate club is going to be able to maintain grounds, collect admission, have security, build stands to hold even 5,000, let alone 85 or 90,000. And so the universities began taking this over because the students couldn't manage it, even all the way down to the granular level of things like cheerleading. Cheerleading was originally something that was, essentially students cheering on their peers.
As one does.
In a way that you would appreciate. My roommate plays on the football team, so I'm out there. The problem is that some of those
decorate
cheers,
their lockers during the
right,
week.
yes. So the problem is that some of those cheers got a little off color. So for example, when Chicago still played big-time football, they had a guy named Walter Eckersall, who was a phenomenal, he would have been the Heisman Trophy winner if we'd had the Heisman Trophy back there. And when they played Michigan cheered, Ecky, Ecky, break his little necky. And Harvard and Yale had a reference to blue stocking Harvard men and an off-color reference that I won't even repeat about Harvard women. And those kinds of things made the university in the same way. Now universities get a little uptight when they lose control of the narrative. This was what brought college sports into the institution.
So, Paula, is there any room between my idealism and his deep cynicism?
I think at this point that ship has completely sailed because, within that, then sports became the community invested in it, right? It wasn't just something that the individual schools did. Then it became something that the alumni and the community then took on, and then, as the word that is ever used today, sports became the front porch of all these schools. It became the brand. Like, that is how, outside of the school, you identified with that school.
Crimson Tide kind of stuff. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And that, and then that took off. And then TV comes in.
Does any part of you wish it were true? The kind of idealistic collegiality model.
I do.
But you just say it ain't so.
It isn't, but I wish it were.
I mean, it's, in some sense, yes. I mean, I think there was a point where it kind of felt like, yes, it was big enough and it was exciting enough and there was enough attention, but yet at the same time, you sort of felt like there was some authenticity and some integrity to it. Now, that may have all been bogus because, as you point out, there's still money going under the table. But one of the things that I think, if you look at what has happened recently that has sort of like destroyed all of that, like it used to be pretty cool when you had the conferences like the Big Eight and you know, and like the Pac-12 or whatever they were back originally, that they were aligned regionally, right? And so that sort of added to that, you know, we've got this sort of like identity with these other schools, which kind of goes to the whole, you know, whatever purity aspect of it. And we've got these rivalries that we like doing every year because, you know, we have this sort of, you know, this connection with these other schools.
Up and down the West Coast.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that all gets blown apart. And
Now more than ever.
What?
Now more than ever.
Now more than ever. And you talk about maintaining the student athlete. Well, you have a conference now where you've got UCLA and Rutgers in the same conference. Now, how do you expect any athlete to compete on one side of the country and take up X number of days just going back and forth and then do it again the next week? Like it's
between exams and lectures.
Between, you know. Yeah, I mean, even the professional leagues don't do this, right? Because when they go back and forth, they don't go back home and then they say, oh, now you have to go to class. Like you may, you know.
They don't say that now either, though.
Well,
because most of them, it's a true, actually almost all Division I athletes take Zoom classes. Very few of them have face-to-face classes anymore.
All right, so Kurt, I want you to tell the story. So can we go to 39? This is it, this is one of the stories that's central to your book, which people can buy and you will sign afterwards. This is an amazing story. Of course, this wasn't the stadium then,
The end was unfinished.
So tell us the story of the Rose Bowl in Ohio State, because this is like where this fell apart.
This is what they call the horseshoe, because originally the far end of the stadium was not closed.
Was open, right.
And when Ohio State built their stadium, one of the ways they funded it was through public subscriptions. Literally, people from across the state of Ohio sent in donations. And what it created in the state of Ohio, and they're not unique, but this is just one of the more well-documented cases, is a belief amongst many who had no connection, who were not alums of Ohio State or whose children did not go to Ohio State, but that they were literally invested in the university's football program. It was their thing because they had literally helped pay for it. So speaking to the conference element that Paula just explained has fallen apart, for years, the West Coast Conference, which has gone through varying names, but at the time in the years after World War II was called the American Association of Western Universities, AAWU, but it's basically the forerunner to the Pac-8, which they lent the Arizona schools in, became the Pac-10, and then it became the Pac-12 when Colorado and Utah got in.
Now it's the Pac-2.
Yeah, now it's the Pac-2.
But to this point,
the pure two, or the two-pack.
but to this point,
Yes. So here, right. Ohio State got a chance to play in the Rose Bowl in what would have been January 1st, 1962, because they won the Big Ten. The problem was the contract had lapsed that year between the two conferences. So the conference champion was not by contract required to go. So it was put up for a vote to the faculty.
Of Ohio State.
Yes.
Should we send our extraordinary successful football team to the Rose Bowl?
Right. So you get this moment that those of us in academia just sort of dream about, that faculty actually had this kind of power. And they spent 2 hours in a faculty meeting arguing essentially the role of the university.
What is our purpose?
Right. And one of the things that was tremendously present was the role of the Cold War, and at a time, you know, when we're just beginning, in fact, actually, yes, by the fall of 1961, Kennedy had already pledged to get us to the moon, okay? And he makes, by the way, a college football metaphor reference in that. He talks about how hard it's going to be to get to the moon, and we do the things not because they are easy, but because they are hard, and he says, why does Rice play Texas?
Because they always lose to
right,
Texas.
because
yeah.
this is you know the magnitude.
And he got a giant laugh.
Yeah, not a laugh. They were rousing applause for it. So Ohio State's faculty decide
2-hour debate.
we need to sort of focus the attention of the universities to real serious work. If Ohio State wants to be a university of the first rank, and in particular their position in the American Association of Universities, the AAU, then we need to stop making our football team the front porch of the university.
Right.
So they vote no.
We're not sending our
We're not
team.
sending Ohio
And
State
what were
to the Rose
what was
Bowl.
the ramification? What happened?
There was a riot in Columbus. And, I mean, literally, they
big
marched.
riot.
They marched. Yeah, they tore up the faculty Senate, the faculty lounge where the Senate meeting. They broke all the windows. They hung the university president in effigy. They marched on his house. Then they went downtown to the bars on High Street, and then you can only imagine how things accelerated from there. And at one point, Woody Hayes, who was the coach at Ohio State, was out of town actually, but this didn't happen. So he was at a conference. And he supposedly, after somebody told him this, he walked the streets of, I think they were in Detroit or something, in the rain for like 2 hours so he could calm down. And so somebody finally got a hold of him for a comment. And he says, well, I respect the faculty's decision, if not their wisdom. But yeah, that's something that could never happen now, because to turn down a major bowl game and the millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Impossible even to conceive of it
Right.
today, right?
Absolutely.
But at the time, this was still a debate in American life.
Right.
And Ohio State faculty did what they regarded as the proper thing with disastrous results.
For all of my cynicism about what college athletics has always been, there were moments where it could have been different. And those moments have always passed for reasons I'm not going to get into. But this was a moment at which there was still real hope. I mean, there was a faculty member at Ohio State named Armitage, James Armitage. And the passion with which he argued, he was a Spanish professor. And one of the things he was talking about is the resources we throw at the football team. And he says, if you gave me those kinds of resources, he was the advisor to the Spanish club, we could go beat the Spanish team at the University of Buenos Aires, okay? and while, you know, his point was, we're playing for keeps against the Soviets here, in particular against the space race. And yet our grad students are scrambling for student aid, which actually wasn't even federally available yet until the National Defense Education Act. But yet we'll give the football team anything they need. And this was essentially what what animated the debate at Ohio State. And so there was a belief that we might still
Draw the line.
yeah, or at least get an off-ramp.
Let's go to 31 just for a second here. Money.
Oh yeah, the best job you can get, hands down, is a fired college football coach.
So
I mean,
Jimbo Fisher
truly.
is Texas
Yes.
A&M, and he's fired and given a farewell contract fulfillment of $75 million.
Yeah.
Well, he's
It's
not
called
giving
dead
it.
money.
He's not giving it, but that's
got
in
it.
his
He got
contract.
it.
Yeah, I mean,
And that's why I think that creates a lot of distaste in the American public. Let's go to the next one. This is closer to home. And we had to change this graphic an hour ago because I had 50 million in, and the experts here said, oh no, it comes to 85 million for Russell Wilson to go away. What happened? What happened? I hate to be the lone idealist on this stage, but when I grew up in North Dakota, and our team was the Minnesota Twins, and Harmon Killebrew was my hero. He was 5th on the home run charts at that time. His retirement salaries last year was $250,000 per year. Now they're paid tens and tens of millions of dollars. And that's how capitalism works, the market, et cetera. Is this okay, you two?
Well, they're two totally different things, right?
Yeah.
What happens with college athletics, because you still have the fact that these departments are technically part of a larger university, and although I think there's like 24 of them which are considered self-sustaining, meaning that they generate enough revenue to pay for themselves, all of the rest are being somehow subsidized by the university. So when you talk about giving money to someone to go away, for a lot of these schools, A&M's not one of them, but for a lot of these schools, like you're talking about eating into money that true opportunity costs. So there's that. With professional sports, I mean, they exist to make money. Like there was never any illusion of
They're selling widgets.
Right.
It's a sports.
And when you look at decisions on spending money to get rid of somebody, I think it really just comes down to it's the cost of doing business, and you see that even though that looks like a big figure, the payoff to that is even bigger. And you're right, the money is crazy. It's absolute crazy money, and it creates, when we talk about social issues with sports, which is a lot of what I've dealt with in the last few years. I mean, it creates this entitlement attitude, and then that's when you start getting guys getting in trouble with sexual violence and stuff like that.
Drugs, women, violence.
Right. There's a whole other element to the detrimental effects of money, but at the same time, you could say this is the same with professional and college sports. I mean, it's an arms race.
Sure.
One of the things that I find intriguing about this, and I've gotten last night at dinner, for those of you who were at the reception for Dale, I got to chat with several of you, and in talking with Clay, I sort of understand, many of you are not from Vail. You achieved a substantial amount of success and were able to move to Vail, and many of that was in the private sector. And one of the ways you probably got successful was by evaluating talent. One of the things about college athletic directors, as the money has just skyrocketed, they have, in my mind, gotten way the hell out of their depth. And in particular, whoever the athletic director was at Texas A&M botched the hire so bad and the contract negotiations that he's now paying their athletic foundation is paying $75 million to the wrong employee. That's something that we would never tolerate in the private sector, I don't think, or at least not very long. Okay, and for those of you who've run your own business, you might put that in maybe smaller, fewer zeros, but that's essentially what's happened here. And as the money has gotten so outsized, what a college athletic director looks like, I think, is going to change drastically, because there are so many more consequences to it. You don't need to be able necessarily to just go make sure Jim Bob Billy makes his $100 million or his $100,000 donation and show up in glad hand. And you now have to be a corporate manager at a level that has never really been the case. And this in particular is in the case of television negotiations. If you are familiar with what happened to the Pac-12 and their demise, part of that, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but part of that is the conference commissioner was, I think, out of his depth in dealing with contract negotiations with television.
So just quickly, because we're just about running out of time, we got about 15 minutes before we go to the audience, and we want to make sure we do that. I'm going to skip ahead here, James, and go to number 40. All right, so I looked this up. Average cost to attend an NFL game in 2023, $377, up from $235 in 2022. Average cost to attend an NBA game, $95. Average cost MLB, Major League Baseball, $53. That seems like a bargain to me. Average cost to attend an NHL game, $100. WNBA, now $100, up dramatically from the last couple of years. Average cost to attend the Super Bowl, $8,500. Field box seats at Fenway Park in 1987, $14. So by paying everybody so much and building these gazillion-dollar stadiums, and the teams hold the communities hostage, if you don't build us that stadium, we'll move to Tampa or we'll move to St. Augustine, and the television contracts and the commercialization of everything, that drives ticket prices up. So an average family of 4 or 5 going to an NFL game, $1,000. I couldn't do that. I don't think you could do that. You get to go because you're ESPN. But I mean, this can't be okay. This can't be okay to do this. And the hot dog and the beer are $35 more.
Oh, the concessions are, yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
What's to happen here?
Minor league baseball games.
Right, exactly. And it's more fun now.
Bring your dog to, with all the crazy stuff that I say that sort of, it is, they are charging these prices and yet they're still getting people to pay for them, right? So there's, that's going to happen. But I think this is also giving an opportunity to all of those other sports. And I sort of joke about the minor league baseball, but really, when you look at it, it's more fun, it's more family oriented, and they are capitalizing on this and sort of giving, because there's no way I would take my 12-year-old kids to any of these because their attention span on this, like, I'm not gonna, it's not worth it. Like, they will not know the difference between this and if I took them to the Kansas City Royals, they wouldn't know the difference between that if I took them to the Omaha Storm Chasers, and they would like that.
Storm Chasers, that's the team?
Yeah, it used to be the Omaha Royals, but yeah. And there's like a little amusement park thing, and they can get all the Dippin' Dots they want or whatever. But yeah, you're right. It's not the way it was. Is it okay? I mean,
Is it?
No, I don't. I mean, in terms of how we look at sports in the history of things, is it okay? No, I don't think it's okay. But I mean,
it is what it is.
It is what it is, essentially, right? And it's a special thing to be able to do that. But I will say, now I'm a little bit biased because I work for ESPN. In many ways, watching it at home on your TV is actually a better experience.
We agree, of course.
I'll just throw that out there.
I think that one of the things that we have to reconcile here is the way we acculturate ourselves to sports and the role that sports has historically played for many of us is changed drastically. I would, if you're here tonight, I'm presuming you have at least a moderate interest in sports, and at some point in your life you have attended a live sporting event, and more than likely that was with a parent. And you probably have vivid memories of that. I can still tell you almost everything that happened on July 14th, 1976, when the Angels played the Yankees in the old Anaheim Stadium. It was the first my parents took me for my birthday. And I remember that day.
How old were you?
I was 6 years old.
This was in Anaheim.
Mm-hmm. I remember when my parents took me to my first UCLA football game. That, for many of us, if you've ever read the author Dorrance Kearns Goodwin, she's a political historian, but she has a memoir about growing up as a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. It's called Wait Till Next Year. It's wonderful. But she talks about how she shared baseball with her father. And many of us, sports is something that we share as a family sort of source of identity, who we root for. And part of that is getting to go to the game as a liminal or a transitional, a ritualized experience. We don't do that anymore, in part because of this, in part because we have 64-inch plasma televisions, and I'd rather spend $8.95 for a six-pack than $15 for a single. But I mean, my two children, both of them are huge Angels fans. We didn't get to take them to an Angels game until we went back to California to visit. But by that point, the ship had already sailed. My son's a huge UCLA fan. He's never been to a UCLA football game because television now is the way in which we learn to go to sports. Yeah. The second point that I would point out to you is what going to the game actually means for many of us. If you're a college basketball fan, for the men's Final Four, anybody know where the men's Final Four is held anymore? Seriously? They're in football stadiums. They're in football stadiums, right. So imagine sitting in, well, I'm really bad because I don't follow the NFL, but I remember one time it was in the old Pontiac Silverdome, which doesn't even exist. Sitting in the upper deck at the Pontiac Silverdome to try to watch a basketball game. Your view has got to be god-awful horrible.
Well, you've got the Jumbotron.
Well, not then. So my point is, why do we do it? Because you can say you went to the Final Four. Because you've got ticket stubs. In other words, so much of sports now is not really about your own rooting interest or the experience of acculturating your child to it. It's the status of it. And that, I think, is a big problem, because at that point now we've stripped out some of that emotional connection, and then you run into, if you're the NFL or some of these other leagues, whatever happens if something else becomes more status-driven.
Let's go to 48. Paula, he's a historian. You've had to cover things like this. Unpack this a little bit. So Colin Kaepernick decides to protest race relations in America by kneeling at the game. And the country really erupted over this.
Right. I'm trying to remember this, if I'm placing this in I don't want to get the time. I'm trying to figure out how far apart this was from when the whole Black Lives Matter.
This is 2015.
Yeah, so it's quite some time before then. I think you, I think you had kind of what you were saying before about how, you can embrace your race up until a point. And I think for a lot of people, and I think this is this is right before, right before the 2016 elections. And I think this was a real part of people being very divided on, how we recognize race and how we recognize in this issue with patriotism and what is okay. And, it was interesting after this to see some examples of this happening in like youth sports too, and sort of how different communities responded and who would come forward and support the athletes who protested versus who would say, you've been given this privilege, this is disrespectful to your country. And I think for a lot of people, when they look back at Kaepernick, I think it was a real start to and going back to sports as a lens, this was a real start to what we started to see happening like nationwide in the next several years.
Yeah, shut up and dribble became a kind of famous Fox approach. Let's go to 49 for a minute. Kurt, this is nothing new. It's just more prevalent now, and of course television has greatly expanded everyone's awareness of all of this, but these are the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, and Johnny Carlos and Tommy Smith, is right?
Yeah.
Are putting their fist up with black gloves to protest American apartheid or Jim Crow or what the unfinished work of the civil rights movement, for which they were banished from the Olympic Village. And then the man in front is Australian, is he not?
Yes, Peter Norman.
And he also was protesting in a more quiet way.
Yes, when they were preparing for the medal ceremony, Smith and Carlos were talking about what they were going to do, and Peter Norman from Australia, with their own tragic history with the Aboriginal population, was very much in sympathy. So he asked if there was something that he could do, and you'll notice on his left breast there, he's wearing a round button, which was from the Olympic Project of Human Rights, the OPHR, which was the movement founded by Harry Edwards at Ohio State that was calling for this kind of social activism.
For which
Norman was also banished and never ran for the Australian national team again.
So some of you remember this moment, right? And the outrage that the country had a debate about this. And the question was, is this okay? And at the time, much of the country said it is not okay, but it happened. And now if you go to the next slide, this is San Jose State. They were from San Jose State, and this is a statue group in honor of that moment. And now we look back on this mostly with respect and admiration, don't we? In retrospect.
I think some of us do. I think there is a strong comparison that we can make here with Kaepernick and Smith and Carlos and juxtapose it in the larger context of people like Jackie Robinson, Joe Louis. These are black athletes who achieved great success, but they mostly did it on white terms. And what I mean by that was they didn't make a great deal of hay over their blackness.
They tried to keep below the radar as much as possible.
One of the things about Joe Louis that is often made as a point of comparison to Jack Johnson, Joe Louis was married to a black woman. Jack Johnson was decidedly not. He was a devout Christian. In other words, he didn't do things that challenged the racial norm and in particular white anxiety about the proper place of blacks, particularly black men. Jackie Robinson was specifically, essentially solicited by the Dodgers because he had a college education, because he had some experience in the Deep South in the Army. In other words, he knew what segregation looked like. In other words, he was prepared. And if you watched the movie, the 42 that came out, as it was a remake of the Jackie Robinson story with Harrison Ford, and there's this line where he says, "Do you want a guy who doesn't have the guts, to fight back?" And he says, "I want somebody who's smart enough to not fight back." In other words, you need to realize
you're going to take abuse and you're going to take it.
And you've got to just keep your mouth shut, okay? And the difference here is, and other things too, there were prohibitions, and I've interviewed athletes, black athletes on college campuses, don't ever be seen dating a white girl by any means. The argument in the late 60s and through the 70s about the length of hair, I've never seen so much contested space over black hair. Because though, the Afro was very much out of the political movement of the 60s and the early 70s, that was a demonstration of black pride. In other words, it was black people, black athletes in particular, refusing to apologize for being black, okay? In other words, I'm no longer going to just be happy that you've let me play. You're going to have to accept me on my terms. And so Kaepernick and Carlos and Smith have violated that unspoken agreement. Because mostly, and Carlos and Smith are particularly talking about poverty rates, the black disparity, particularly amongst the Great Society and the failure of the Great Society to really address that. And Kaepernick is explicitly talking about police brutality, which we discovered with George Floyd. He was not wrong.
Paula, you were going to say.
Right. One of the other things when you look at whether athletes are speaking out or whether they're shutting up and dribbling, comes down to their sponsorship, right? And so, you've got, I don't want to pick on anyone, but you have human rights abuses in China, and you have athletes who are called upon to address that. But oh, wait a minute, the shoe company who sponsors me has a lot of business there, so maybe I don't want to say something, and you see sponsors, and you've seen it with several of them, Tiger Woods, with many, when something happens, and with that case, if they do something nefarious, that's one thing, but there is a real sensitivity on speaking out or doing something to upset your sponsor, and that's what I think keeps a lot of athletes away from being more vocal about,
It's complicated
issues.
in several directions.
Yes.
And just go to 51 for a moment. We're going to move quickly here. We don't have time for this, but everyone knows this story. Muhammad Ali and the price he paid for becoming a black Muslim and speaking out about these questions. And if you go to 52 for a minute, he is said to have said, and probably did say, I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me. And that was one of the most terrific public crises over sport during my lifetime. Anyway, go ahead.
The one point I want to make, and this is my own interpretation of reading this content, and this is something I focus on and write a lot about. When we elevate stories like Jackie Robinson and Joe Louis and others, we create a constant, what I call the sports movie narrative. Okay, if you've ever seen any movie about sports, there's a very formulaic element to it. But it's essentially about perseverance, triumph. In other words, it represents what we often want to see sports demonstrate. And in particular, these are values, we talk about amateurism and the ability to play sport without being compensated for it, obviously has some very specific class elements.
And racial elements.
Okay, right. So, and then, which you segue into that very rapidly. And so we can lionize Jackie Robinson and we can lionize a handful of others well past him because he embodies what we want, and when I say we, I mean the dominant culture, what we want to see. Ali, Carlos and Smith, Kaepernick, they continue to remind us that the dominant culture still has a long way to go. In other words, there are still problems in our society that a sports victory is not going to fix.
And the Hollywood narrative of perseverance eventually leads to acceptance is not in their minds true.
And white folk have got a long way to go before
Just to
we can
54
start
for
doing
a minute,
that.
if we can go to 54 for a moment. Because we can't not at least address this for a second. Women's track and field competition, not fair, bigot. And the next one. So Paula, we got, this is not fair, but give us just a couple of quick minutes on the crisis of transgenderism in sport.
Yeah, this is such a hard issue because it's not just two sides, right? I think there's like 3 or 4 sides to this, and you have these athletes who have decided that, I don't use the right term, but they are identifying with a gender that is not their gender at birth, and they want to embrace that fully, and they want to compete in sports, and so they're, these schools and sort of the NCAA are like, okay, well, we want to be respectful of this and understand that we're understanding of their rights and their we just want to make this inclusive, but at the same time we want to protect the female athletes from some legitimate concerns, which are unfair competition and their own health and safety. And this is so up in the air because you do have a segment of the population who are advocates for women's sports who are opposed to transgender athletes on primarily political grounds. And then you have a segment who really do have the genuine concerns of, well, is competition fair? Is it not fair? I want to support this population, but at the same time, I don't feel like I should compete against someone for whom there's no way I can, there is no way biologically that I can. And then you have another community that says, regardless of any competition or whatnot, our transgender population has been discriminated against and we should be able to compete in whatever sport we want to compete in. Okay. So we talk a lot about the NCAA, we talk a lot about these individual schools, but at the end of the day, the main arbiter of this is actually the federal government, going back to Title IX, and it's the U.S. Department of Education. And their attempt at solving this makes sense in theory, but not necessarily in practice. And so what their objective is, and this has not been approved yet, they've sort of punted on this until after the election, but what they're trying to say is they're going to leave it up to individual schools to say, okay, where it matters, then you can restrict the gender on a particular team. So where it matters, if let's pick swimming, for example. If you were able to say, okay, without making any sort of changes, if you have a biological male who wants to compete on a female team, and you determine that there's no way that you can, have any sort of competitive equity, then maybe you could say no. But you have to justify that, and you have to justify it in science.
School A as opposed to school D.
Right. And then they're saying where it doesn't matter, then you have to let anybody compete on any team. So the examples they give are sort of like, elementary school sports, club sports, where there's not money or a career or something of substance at stake. Now, that is a very, very subjective term because, the club rugby team, even though nobody's going to go play professional club rugby, whether they win the championship or not really means a lot to them, right? But what exactly does it mean to say that something is at stake? And so this, in order for all of these schools to make this decision on their own, also complicates the fact that, well, if you have one school making a decision that it's okay in this sport to have biologically male athletes compete against females, but a school in your same conference not having the same, then how is that going to work? So what they're trying to say, I think if you take politics out of it, which is really hard with this issue, but what they're trying to say is where competition matters and where you can't, through whatever, whether it's hormones or whatever else you can do biologically, where you can't make it a more level playing field, then you can restrict the genders to their biological gender at birth. But where it doesn't matter, then you should let anybody compete anywhere. Trying to figure out exactly what the metrics are for that and trying to do that across all of the different conferences and competitions is not anything I wish on anybody.
And it's unfair to ask you to do all this in such a short amount of time, but I think it's fair to say this debate is going to go on for a long time.
Well, and the other thing is this whole thing is going to be, at the end of the day, will be determined by the election too. And
by the election and by lawsuits, and we're a long road ahead. I'm really cognizant of the time. I'm so sorry, but let's go with questions from the audience, James.
Well, I'm willing to bet we'll have some questions on this topic. So
let's raise your hand. We'll get to as many as we can. Be brief.
I'll come around to you. Please speak directly into the microphone, not over the top of it. Stand if you're able. And so we can get to as many questions as possible, limit your context. Megan will be keeping an eye out on this side of the room. She's in the back now, and I'll start on this side of the room. And if you're online, submit your questions in the Q&A feature. And Bill, you're going to get us started.
But as we wait, let's just thank these two for their great commentary.
Yeah. Paula Levine and Kurt Kemper. Clay Jenkinson. All right, Bill, start us off.
You beat me to it, but thank you, Paula and Kurt, and of course Clay for being here. Clay, we know we love you. However, I'm going to have to disagree with your thought on college athletics relative to Kurt's position.
All right.
Unfortunately. What's going on in athletics today with the NIL is really nothing new. It's just now not under the covers as it was before. It's in the open because all the colleges with the big endowments and the big support they have from their sponsors end up getting the best players, and it's very, very difficult to compete. My question and my concern is once these players go to a team, after 1 year, they are eligible for the transfer portal, which means they can change and go to another team the next year. And the third year, they can do the same thing, whereas previously, they had to skip a year. They had to sit out a year if they would transfer. How can a coach possibly keep a team together where every year he's having to build a new team because these kids, the amount of money that's being offered to transfer from one team to another. Duke University had 5 basketball players, and I'm sure they were talented players, move and leave Duke after the first year and go to other universities. Something's got to be done to do something to stop this part of the NIL.
Kurt, then Paula.
Well, I share with you one of the things that I think most of us like about college sports is sort of the institutional representation. If you're an alum, then you think about, those kids as those are our kids. They lived in the same dorm I did, or some kind of a way in which we want to identify with that. And of course, this model that you're talking about just blows that to hell. I mean, we actually, there are teams now where when you have a coaching change, literally they will have nobody on the roster. The entire team will leave, so they got to start all over again, and that's not uncommon now. So I guess the answer to your first question, which is how is a coach going to do this, the job just changed. I mean, that's the short answer is suddenly now what they call roster management has become a much more prominent issue. And if you're going to succeed at that, then you'll be successful probably in talent acquisition. The bigger issue I think you're getting to is how are most of us going to want to even watch something like that because it doesn't represent what we think about in college sports. And I don't have an answer for that. I can tell you personally, I find it very, very difficult to pursue college sports. My wife will tell you that on any given fall Saturday 20 years ago, I would get up at 9:30 and
with your six-pack.
Yeah, and if Hawaii had a home game, I wasn't going to bed until 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And I don't find as much of a draw to it for exactly the very issues that you talk about.
Yeah, Paul, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, with basketball, you've always had the one and done where they would go, not that they would go to different schools, but they would, go to the NBA. And I think people sort of, I don't say got used to that, but that was the churn for quite a while. But it is, I mean, it's one of the reasons that coaches were opposed to the NIL, and to be sort of facetious, your question is, what is the coach to do? Well, have wealthier donors. I mean, which is unfortunate, but I think, coming back to money and like that's part of it. And you're right, as you said, it completely changes the job. On the flip side, part of what it I don't want to say solved, but was it fair previously that if you were an athlete and you were recruited by a particular coach, is it fair that you're stuck there? I mean, that's what I'm saying. That we're in the omelet making stage of this, because there, as many problems as it has caused, it is in reaction to things that weren't really fair to the athletes, or at least from the athlete population. They did not see them as fair to begin with. So that's what I'm saying, is that this is all going to somehow, some way, work its way out.
But we still have a certain respect for the NBA or MLB player who spends his entire career at one team. We still prize that. It's increasingly rare. Go ahead.
It's my impression that this is an almost uniquely American phenomenon with respect to colleges and universities. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Europe looks at us and it's weird. I have a
on
colleague,
all sorts of fronts,
yes.
really.
But I mean, they don't understand why we put this in sports. I've got a colleague from Canada even, and he thinks it's bizarre. It's an entirely just it doesn't exist anywhere else.
Capitalism plus sports equals chaos.
Yeah.
But you would argue though that there is not less passion for sports in those countries. It's
The difference is the role education plays elsewhere outside of the United States. In the United States, the private sector, even though we have public universities, education is essentially a commodity, okay? And so sports has become the front porch. It's a way that we can welcome in people who aren't alums. We've commodified higher education. It doesn't exist that way in Europe, and it's not much like that in Canada.
James?
Hi, I'm Mike Ellis, and I did play football for University of Oklahoma 1 year in '64. And Bud Wilkinson was there, and he left before we started the next season. But back then, I made $50 a month for laundry, and I thought it was great. Today,
that is a lot.
NIL, to me, has ruined sports, and I think it's the issue of the NC2A that has not put any regulations on these young men. And a friend of mine, if you can hear my hearing aids ring, but can't. Anyway, a friend of mine who was an agent, his biggest issue was these young boys coming out of high school, going into college, and making 60 grand a month. He couldn't do anything about it. They did everything they could. And the first thing they did was buy a $25,000 stereo. Why hasn't the NC2A put some kind of regulations? And now the universities can pay students, athletes. Why haven't they put any regulations? Pay them so much? I agree they should. But to turn loose, Caleb Williams that went from OU followed Lincoln Riley, made $2 million a year. 5 years ago, if you were a quarterback and you really wanted to think about being an NFL player, you went to OU, where Lincoln Riley was, and he produced 3 Heisman Trophy players in 4 years. But all that's gone. How's a coach keep it together? Why haven't they put regulations on the students and how much money they can take home, or put a trust involved?
Well, there's 2 answers to your question, and Paula will have a very different but probably more informed perspective, so I'll keep it short. One, the NCAA fought this for as absolutely long as possible. They absolutely wanted they gave up every opportunity to try to manage the boulder coming downhill, and instead just laid in the tracks. And for a while they could do that because the Supreme Court sided with them. The Supreme Court sided with them in 1961 or 2 on workmen's compensation. They sided with them in the 70s when they created subdivisions and broke up divisions 1, 2, and 3. The NCAA didn't, and even on amateurism, even after they lost the 1982 or 83 Supreme Court decision regulating or deregulating television, they continued to side with them on issues of amateurism and student pay and what the legal definition of student athlete was. So they thought they could still keep winning. And then not just the Supreme Court changed, but culture changed. And so they kept throwing themselves on the track, but they lost at every turn. So they gave up the opportunity to try to manage it. And I'll actually stop there and let
Well, no, I think it's interesting to point out that, as we know, looking at all the issues that have come before the Supreme Court over the last few years and the politicization of how they come down on their decisions, on this one they were unanimous.
Unanimous.
So, yeah.
So how many of you share this man's view that you've lost some interest in professional sports and collegiate sports because of all these factors of money and pay? And so, I mean, this is a real issue. So that, yes, we get why this has happened, and you just gave an excellent account of how we failed to do this, but I think millions of Americans are put off by all this and are losing interest. And even if they still watch this stuff, it ain't the same in their hearts and in their ways of thinking about sport. Is that fair?
We don't know yet, I think. I mean, you created what you think was a small caveat, but it's a big one. Television revenue is what's driving all this. So even if you hate it, but you're still watching it,
you're part of it.
Then ESPN is going to continue to still write those massive checks. So what we don't know yet, and what I think is going to evolve in the next, say, 10 years, because we're, to use Paula's phrase, we're still in the omelet making stage. How many of us will begin to decide, no, I'm a fill in the blank, I'm a CU alum, but this isn't what I want to look at. And do you begin to go elsewhere? Because that will be one tail. The other thing that I think is probably more likely is we're not done hearing what the courts are going to decide in terms of legislation. And the big question is, are these students who are about to be getting paid a lot, and if it comes directly from the universities or nonprofit foundations that are affiliated with the universities and enjoying the university's tax-exempt status, then are they employees? And once we decide if they're employees, then do they need to be students at all? And then that's when I think most of us are like, yeah, I'm out.
Right.
But we don't know where that's going to go yet.
But for so many people, when you talk about this issue, that is exactly where they end up, which is okay. And to your question about where this goes and why the NCAA, I mean, the lawsuits are a big part of it. Yeah, it is like that's sort of where your train of thought goes, and then you're like, well, are we like? Does that just kill it? Is that what kills people's loyalty and passion and sense of collective, acknowledgement with it? I can't even sort of fathom how that works, how that would even work, and how all of the regulations that would have to be completely trampled to make that happen.
It'd be fun to take a break and do 4 more hours here because there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Amazing. We have time for a few more questions.
Yeah.
Thanks, Clay. This is somewhat of a statement rather than a question.
Uh-oh.
I got it. But I heard Oklahoma. I went to the University of Iowa, been following Caitlin Clark for 4 years now. But what concerns me, Iowa's a fairly small state, but you have to compete now with Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Auburn. All those people got big checkbooks. So where's that student's going to go? They're going to go where the money is. And that's the danger on sports as I see it across the country. I'd like to hear your comment on it.
Well, Paula brought up the comment the moment that there used to be, particularly in college football, regional sports, or at least a regional appeal. And for Iowa, even if they went, say, 9-2, but you made it to the Rose Bowl, that was, next to God there. So maybe you weren't in the championship, discussion, which was a fictional thing before the playoff, but there was something for you to play for in that regional level, winning the conference. We've nationalized the game by drastically increasing the television revenue, but we've destroyed that model that you're talking about. And I think the outcome is going to be, we're going to really be talking about maybe 30 or 40 teams that are going to play big-time college football. And whether a school like Iowa makes the cut or not, and as my parents went to UCLA, I'm not sure UCLA wants to play at that level either. And I think that it's going to be the Texases and the Alabamas and the Michigans and the Ohio States, and they're going to do it, and the rest of us are just going to get left with,
It's almost gonna be like the NFL model where, you know, the two sides is going to essentially be like the SEC and then some schools from the Big Ten. And then that's in terms of money, that's who's gonna be able to compete.
And how soon are we going to pay high school athletes too? This day is coming.
We've been talking about opinions, and we've been talking about politics and so forth. Biology, I know something about biology, and we haven't discussed the trans or had a question about the trans athletes. Right now, if you apply for a passport, you get to check an M or an F or 2 or 3 other choices. I'm wondering what the birth certificates are doing, whether a mom delivers a little boy and she really wanted a girl, so she's going to check the F, if that existed. So each of us have 2 X chromosomes if we're female, and we have XY if we're male. So maybe we should, instead of having M and F, all those boxes should be 2 X's or X and Y, and you can't change it. And biological men, or even young adolescent athletes, have already got a lot of testosterone in their system. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about X and X and X and Y?
So the question is, do we live in a binary system of born male, born female, chromosomic, or is gender a construction and it's much, much more complicated than we like to think?
I am going to tell you that this is so much of just what you believe, right? And I'm not dodging the question, but I mean, you really hit the nail on the head, which is like, where do you come down on this? And there is no right. There is no, even if someone were to say, well, yes, this is the way it is, or this isn't, it all comes down to, how do you feel about this issue? How do you feel about how someone identifies with a particular gender? What does gender even mean? And that's why, you're talking about, you have a history in biology or a background in biology. Like, I am fascinated by this. Like, I really would, one of the stories that I really want to do is, when it comes to this, like, competitive drive and your just how your body works with muscle and everything, like, where does that come down? And I don't think anyone really, when you add the biology and then you add the social component to it, I don't think that anyone's ever going to, we're not all ever going to agree on this, but I think from this perspective of this transgender athlete issue, I would love to know, like, science-wise, can you measure this? Like, can you actually measure this? And can there be any way that you could look at, 2 different biologies and see, okay, is there an equity there? I don't know. I'm fascinated by the science in this, and I'm very fascinated with how this will, if someone really wants to do this and wants to try to get some equity, how that happens. I don't know.
So, this is such a complex issue, and we could spend days just talking about this. But, back in the 1950s or 40s, we thought that if you are male, you're born with a penis, and if you're female, you're born with a vagina, and that's sort of the end of the story. And now there's been a revolution in gender, enormous revolution, especially at the most elite institutions, but also in the Department of Education and so on. And now we don't accept that anymore. We believe it's just much more complicated than that. And now that is the lens through which this is percolating through sport, right?
Right, and you're not, this is one of those things where regardless of what, like if we get to the issue, like I said, about the science, even if you're able to answer that question, your personal views, your religious views, the community in which you were brought up, your family structure, do you have anyone in your circle who has gone through this or who has transitioned or who, all of that factors into how you feel about this, and how you feel about it today might not be how you feel about it, tomorrow or 10 years from now.
And are you entitled to self-identify, which is a huge sovereignty issue of our time. And it's one of the most volatile of all the cultural wars issues. And we're going to see it for a long time. And as you say, it partly depends on the political outcomes of this in later elections.
Right.
There's no easy answer to this. Go ahead.
All right, we have a final question over here.
And then we can stay and chat. I'm so sorry we don't have more time.
Well, look around this room, most people around my age, and so a lot of what we're doing is the way we were. And we grew up in the era, I'm from Alabama, grew up with Bear Bryant, and then the Saban era, and my kids just tell me all the time, it's not your world anymore. So a lot of what we're seeing...
Your kids are saying this to you?
Oh, yeah. What I'm getting to is all these changes we're talking about matter to us because we've been in this road of going down to the last 60, 70 years. My first football game was 1959, and just right when Bear Bryant came to Alabama. So those days are gone. So what the kids today are going to see is what's going on. And so they won't have this history. They won't be arguing about, the great teams of the 50s and 60s and the players that came along and how it was done and et cetera. And so it's just like right now, if you look at pro football, when I grew up, most players stayed with their teams forever. And now this free agency, teams are different every year. That's what college ball is going to be like. It's not going to be like the way we grew up.
Thank you. So just a last word and then to James. Just keep in mind that, and this, Kurt, maybe you could just say one sentence or two on this, that there was a time in our lifetime in the 1960s when integrated sports teams, often from the north, when they were going to play in southern zip codes, would leave their black athletes behind and say, we just aren't taking you to this game. You'll have to understand that's just the situation. And it was very widespread.
Yeah, but by the 60s that had ended. Those were the so-called gentlemen's agreements. But yes, that was common in the 30s and the 40s.
And so my point is that things that what seemed extraordinarily volatile in 1960 or 68 or 72, I remember hearing that, for example, that in Las Vegas, until the late 1970s, when an African American walked into certain casinos, he or she would be taken by the shoulder and said, we think you'll find a more interesting casino down the street. And we're talking about social revolutions that are roiling, and we're in the midst of some now, and gender and transgender are central to this. And as you say, 35 years from now, who knows what that generation will think of all this, but they'll probably look back on us and say, why were they so stirred up? Or maybe not. Thank you. James, go ahead.
Let's start with a round of applause. Paula Levine, Kurt Kemper, Clay Jenkinson.